The Business of Biotech is produced by Life Science Connect and its community of learning, solving, and sourcing resources for biopharma decision makers. If you're working on biologics process development and manufacturing challenges, you need to swing by bioprocessonline.com. If you're trying to stay ahead of the cell or gene therapy curve, visit cellandgene.com. When it's time to map out your clinical course, let clinicalleader.com help. And if optimizing outsourcing decisions is what you're after, check out outsourcepharma.com. We're Life Science Connect, and we're here to help. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech, and my guest today is a repeater. He last joined us in late 2021, way back on episode 73 of the podcast. But he's welcome back anytime because he's among the most thoughtful biotech conversationalists I've had the pleasure of sitting down with. Brian Finrow is a lawyer by training, and if that doesn't make him an outsider by default, the work his company is doing surely does. Finrow is founder of Lumen Biosciences, a company that's working in earnest to democratize or improve the cost and accessibility of biologics by developing therapeutic molecules from spirulina. That's a great start, but even Finrow will admit that the safety, replicability, and availability advantages of spirulina address just a fraction of the democratization effort. The bigger challenges, the cost of clinical and commercial activities, are much harder to solve, but that didn't stop Finrow and I from addressing them when we met in San Francisco to record this episode. Let's give it a listen.
Brian Finrow joined me, I believe it was episode 73, which was a long, long time ago.
It's been a while. Yeah.
It was like, I think, close to the end of 2021. It was my first exposure to Lumen Biosciences, the company that you founded and served as CEO. So I don't know, two plus years have gone by, 2.5 years. I thought we'd start maybe just with an update. Longtime listeners may remember that episode. It was an interesting conversation, but maybe just you could probably go long on this, right? But in the ensuing 2.5, close to 3 years, give us an update on some recent progress at Lumen.
Yeah, happy to. Just real briefly, more of the same. Basically, if anybody happens to remember that prior conversation,
well, it's out there. If you don't, go listen to that one first, and then come back.
There we go. Yeah, it's a prequel. Mm-hmm. So more of the same from us. We've no great surprises. It's all continuing to work just like we expected. And if anything, I say where we've learned is that the breadth of application for the platform is larger, if anything, than what we were really conceptualizing 2.5 years ago. The big dramatic thing, of course, that happened in the interim was the COVID-19 pandemic came and went. And that was important for us, particularly because we do a lot of work funded by the U.S. federal government, NIH, Department of Defense, BARDA. So a lot of that pandemic defense work has been happening at Lumen, as it has with a lot of companies. And so that was really important, building out a lot of our infrastructure. We built a much larger GMP manufacturing facility, completed a couple more clinical trials. We've got a bunch more trials teed up for this year, added a couple commercial programs and several other clinic-bound, but not yet in a clinic, charitable, I'll call them charitable programs as well. So just more growth, but more all along the same lines of what we discussed 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how COVID affected the business climate in a positive way in some cases. For you, it was more federal engagement, probably more resources along those lines, non-traditional support. For our business, people weren't traveling, people weren't coming to conferences like this. They just weren't happening. You couldn't. So, podcasts and live digital events, really boosted our business. Now, full transparency, we felt that taper off a bit as we've recovered, as the world has gotten back to normal. Are you feeling any of the same? Like, do you feel like that momentum that perhaps ironically COVID helped build in biotech, not just at Lumen, but in biotech in general, has faded?
So some of it has, yeah, for sure. I mean, like in discrete areas, but there's been some real improvements, I think, to the way the world works. Something that hasn't stuck around is, well, I mean, basically, just be honest and blunt about it. Nobody cares about COVID anymore, or pandemic defense. It's like all these lessons we thought we were going to learn once and for all. And
yeah, we're well within 6 feet right now.
That's right. but not just on the financial side. Of course, the VCs were very excited about COVID-19 things for about a hot minute. But even we see this with our federal partners. There's just a lot more challenging to get that research funded again. I mean, it's still happening. A lot of BARDA is doing a lot of work right now. For example, DoD continues to be very interested for their own reasons. So yeah, I mean, some of that came and went, but I think there are some completely permanent changes that have happened. I'll just give you two examples that are relevant to my life. And number one, very usually, people used to go public, and the way you went public is you would charter a jet and you would fly around and do a road show. And I don't think anybody does that anymore. Mm-hmm. It's all Zoom. Everybody does it all on Zoom in like 48 hours and you're done. It's a much better way to go than flying, flocks of bankers and accountants around from city to city on private jets. So I think that's here to stay. It was forced on the industry, and I think it's a better world now without it. The other thing that's even more directly relevant to our work is, there was a big cultural bias against distributed clinical trials before COVID. Yeah, and it was strange because it's like there wasn't like Zoom existed before COVID, right? I mean, DocuSign existed before COVID, but it's a cultural bias against it that people would say, well, yes, no, of course you can use DocuSign to buy a house. But for something important like a consent form for a clinical trial, no, that would be unethical. And then COVID happened, and all of a sudden it became ethical. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. A lot of things that were technically feasible for a long time, but culturally impossible, became commonplace. And I think that there's some real potential for productivity in our industry coming out of things like that's just one example. I think there's a lot of them like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Looking back on the progress that you've made in the past 2 to 3 years, I mean, obviously it's been a very challenging time for a lot of biotechs. The capital markets have been down. All the indices are down. What's your reflection on that? Like, and I know that's a big conversation, but can you point to anything post-COVID that has maybe been a barrier to the pace of progress at Lumen?
Yeah.
Anything in particular? I mean, I know there are a number of things you could probably point to.
Well, yeah, it's always raining somewhere.
Yeah.
During COVID, there was plenty of money, but there was no supply. I mean, even doing crazy things like pipette tips. Remember the pipette tips crisis? Mm-hmm. It just happened to us too, right? Nobody could get pipette tips of all the things in the world. But it was everything, lab space. Companies that use CDMOs couldn't find CDMO space. They were booked years out into the future. CROs were overmaxed because of all the the COVID trials and all the disruption, everything. So pretty much every input into the drug development process was hard to get your hands on, except for money. There was plenty of money around. So the economy did its thing, right? So prices rise, draw in new supply, and then there was this sort of low interest rate phenomenon happened at the same time. A glut of supply came on the market, and then now we have the opposite, right? There's no money. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Federal Reserve Bank took away all the money, and but there's plenty of supply. It's like lab equipment, lab space. CROs are returning phone calls, and everything's you get a hold of. So there's always headwinds, I guess is the short answer.
Yeah. CROs and CDMOs, CMOs like that. That's going to be an interesting space to watch. I think I'm interested in your perspective on that. Like during and immediately post-COVID, I don't think a day went by where hundreds of thousands, if not millions of new manufacturing space were being constructed. Yeah. Right? Like I got press releases every single day. Yeah. Just giant boom. And at the same time, the biotechs that I spent time with still complained about the fact that they were backburnered and it was hard to get time and space with those outsourcing partners. Is that a bubble? Is that a bubble that's like going to come back and bite all the outsourced manufacturing capacity that was built?
I don't know, man. Economists are very fond of pointing out that nobody knows how to call bubbles. Yeah. So every time it seems like there's a bubble, sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. I don't know. But I would say from our approach, we don't participate in a lot of these. We don't use CDMOs, for example, so it's all kind of indirect. But it does seem like it has a lot of characteristics of real estate, which is famously bubble prone. Mm-hmm. Because why? Because they're very capital intensive projects to build, let's say, a new office building or a new apartment building. It takes years, particularly because of the permitting. And then you end up with this sort of high cost capital asset and it comes online just at the time all the other ones come online when there's eventually an economic downturn. So the CDMO capacity, CRO capacity, these seem like kind of lab space capacity, very, very direct analogy. They seem kind of have some characteristics of real estate, which is a famously bubble-prone business where people are always making and losing fortunes over and over again.
Yeah.
So maybe so. Maybe so. I think I've heard that, but
yeah, you're so remind me and our listeners, you don't use CDMOs, you're manufacturing clinical supply in-house in your own facility.
We built our own GMP plant, and then we built a big expansion to the GMP plant, which we brought online last year.
Yeah. So tell us, give me an illustration of that space and what's going on there.
It's very different from, I think, from most of your listeners. We use a unique biomanufacturing host. It's a photosynthetic microbe. It doesn't require sterility to grow. That's the key to the scalability and safety of it. And with this microbe, we can express a variety of very wide range of therapeutic proteins and therapeutic peptides. And the easiest applications are all GI diseases with some kind of a nexus to the GI tract. Now, this has some implications for the GMP facility. One of them is that, well, there are, because of the roots of the company are in cell engineering technology. And so just like with Genentech and Amgen in the 1980s, they also couldn't go to the CDMO industry. Why? It's because it was brand new technology and the industry hadn't been created yet.
Right.
So like them then, we now had really no choice. But the fortunate thing for us is, well, twofold. Number one, because it doesn't require sterility for safe GMP manufacturing, it's way less expensive to build out a facility like this, like literally 2 orders of magnitude cheaper. And the second advantage we have is because of all of our relationships with grant funders in the U.S. federal government, DoD in particular, we were able to convince them to support the capital investment necessary to build the facility. And so that's how we were able to do this big expansion. It's a good thing because we're maxing out the capacity of that newly expanded facility already for clinical trials this year.
Yeah. Are there plans to expand, or
we have plans to expand. We don't even have the funding for that. So if you know someone in DC,
well, that's a good
message. Any listeners?
Yeah, beautiful segue. You mentioned if you know anyone in DC. I mean, that's sort of been the go-to. Tell me a little bit about that. Like, yeah, you and I have chatted about this sort of the I don't know, the silo, I guess, that Lumen kind of finds itself in terms of its funding resources. Like describe why that is. Why is the traditional biotech VC community maybe isn't such a sweet spot for Lumen?
Well, I try not to take it personally. I think I know a lot of them. All of us around the question. Are you calling me out on this? I think I'm just bad at selling stock. The institutional investors we have are all Seattle-based investors. We're based in Seattle, and we have a handful of angel investors as well. Some famous guys among the list. And what they all have in common is they're friends of mine and my co-founder from the biotech world or industry generally. So it's a very unusual capital structure. I like to say it has more in common with the way innovation was funded in the Renaissance. You would go to the Medici family, the rich families, and get your idea funded if you're Leonardo da Vinci, and less in common with the modern professionalized biotech investor, kind of model. That's mixed blessings. The modern biotech model definitely has a lot more capital, and so you can accelerate a lot of things with capital. On the other hand, I've been at companies where they've had a lot of capital. And one of the things that happens in my experience is that a lot of problems that can't be solved with money, that's their first tool because it's just lying around, including a lot of problems that cannot be solved with money, people sort of first go to. And so I wonder sometimes, if we were like lavishly funded, it would be fun to have a few $100 million in the bank. I'm not going to lie.
Sure.
But I wonder if we would have made errors. There's necessity breeds invention, and we've been incredibly inventive.
I mean, isn't that scenario a lot of what's led us to this? I mean, led us to the brink of being overpopulated with biotechs and the ensuing downturn. I mean, doesn't that sort of easy access to capital, hadn't that sort of bred the situation that we found ourselves in for the last 2.5 years?
I kind of wonder, right? I mean, drug development's expensive. It's important to do it safely, so it's never going to be cheap,
right?
Like starting a website. But there's this persistent decline in R&D productivity in our industry that's been written about extensively for 10 or 15 years now by Jack Scannell and other researchers, and you kind of wonder. I mean, does it sort of tracks the growth in capital abundance for the industry, at least for the last 15 years? And is there a causal relationship between the two? Or is it just, we need more capital because it really is fundamentally harder? I don't know. I mean, it's hard to disentangle cause and effect. My scientist colleagues are always telling me so.
Well, I mean, it is difficult to discern that. Like, we've seen a lot of seemingly great, or stated great programs go by the wayside or be backburnered or shelved because of resource constraints. I guess the definition of greatness and what gets money when money gets thinner is up to the investor. I don't know. It sounds to me like your approach is strategic. It sounds like maybe this is CEO spin. You have to be honest with me, Brian. It sounds to me it's more strategic than a matter of that VC community, institutional investors just maybe shying away from a different way of developing biologics, or is there some of that too?
Well, I mean, I can give you some anti-spin because I said at the outset, it might just be that I'm a poor salesman of stock. I'm trying not to take it personally. I have some theories about it. One is very simple. I was talking with a VC I know, an East Coast guy, and I was telling him what we're up to. It's good. It's working, and it's all great. There's big markets, all this stuff. And he says to me, Brian, and I was like, well, why don't you join us? And he says, well, here's the thing, Brian. I love what you're doing. It's amazing. It's definitely going to work. Love the science, all the things, right? Mm-hmm. But he says, look, I got a department of cell therapies over here, and I got a department of oncology, immuno-oncology over here. I don't have a department of whatever the hell you are. Right. It's just like literally no one in the firm to do this. And it's I think of it as being a kind of a version of the innovator's dilemma. Mm-hmm. If you're doing something really innovative, then by definition, there's not a market for your product because it's an innovative product that hasn't existed yet. But there might not also be any investors to invest in your thing.
Yeah.
Before Netscape's IPO, nobody ever heard of the internet, for example. Somebody had to be the trailblazer, and then all of a sudden, a bunch of internet VCs came into existence. And the rest is history. Yeah. So in my optimistic moments, I like to think, wow, this is what we're doing. We're going to be the Netscape. But my pessimistic moments, I think, who the hell are you? How would you know any better? Right, just some guy.
Yeah.
So,
do you consider Lumen in the camp or in the sector of plant-based biologics?
No.
Okay.
No. Well,
tell me like what discerns that? Like, you guys your starting material is spirulina.
Spirulina, yeah.
Right. Uh-huh. You don't equate that to like, some of these companies that are developing antibodies from, some genus of tobacco plant.
There's the reason I'm very, very specific about my word choices, well, partly because I went to law school and practiced law for 10 years. And
good training.
Lawyers are one of the few groups of people that will never say the phrase mere semantics, because the semantics are oftentimes very important. In this case, they are very important. Plants are a certain thing, and spirulina is a cyanobacterium. And cyanobacterium, even though it is photosynthetic like a plant, it's definitely not a plant. Mm-hmm. Why is this important? It's important for a regulatory reason. If you're going to make a drug in a plant, then the FDA, and more importantly, the USDA, and more importantly than the USDA is the farmers' lobby, is going to care a lot about what's going to happen with that plant. Because plants breed asexually, and there's going to be a risk that the gene for your drug is going to go somewhere where maybe it shouldn't. So there's a lot of technologies out there. You can put like protein therapeutics in potatoes, or rice or tobacco, right? And they have their pros and cons. Tobacco leaf is usually transient expression. It's almost always, I think, grown in greenhouses. But from our perspective, we are very interested in not being tarred with the plant brush, simply because we don't want to have a second regulator in the form of the USDA. And more importantly, we don't want to pick a fight with the farmers' lobby. Which is the most powerful, political force in the country.
So you don't run that risk.
No, where cyanobacterium is definitely there's no mechanism for gene escape sexual colonization or anything like that. And it's a very important regulatory and legal distinction. I would say the other thing is more conceptual. I say plant-based biotechnology companies, when I come across them periodically, to me, it always seems like they're just trying to do the same thing everybody else is doing with E. coli or CHO, and trying to save a bit of money on the upstream processing side. What we do is very different. It's a completely different therapeutic modality. You can actually make a injectable monoclonal antibody in tobacco leaves. They've done it in Europe. Actually, they've got a GMP process approved a few years back at Oxford. But to me, I don't understand the utility of it. There's vast amounts of CHO manufacturing capacity in the world. And it's not obvious to me that at scale, particularly with the regulatory headwinds of a plant-based kind of system, that you're going to be able to compete with that enormous amount of sunk capital, just because there's nothing cheaper than the factory that's already been built and depreciated. So what we're doing is wildly different. We're topically delivering cocktails of protein therapeutics to mucosal and other topical surfaces of the body, like the GI tract, intranasally, the skin. And there are almost all of the distinctions, while they're all unlocked by the unique scalability and cost efficiency of our platform. All that matters is the action of the therapeutic proteins themselves and how we design them. So that's actually where almost all of our time gets spent. The fact that it's just grown and something that's photosynthetic is, 7-year-old news that is almost irrelevant, aside from the fact that it's fundamental to making it commercializable and scalable.
Okay. Very good. I'm glad we cleared that up. So what are you doing at an investor conference? Given what you've told us about your strategic approach to investment, what are you looking for here? What's your goal?
Two things, really. We have some pharma partnerships, and there's almost a ritualistic meeting of people that happens at JP Morgan. So we're doing that, and it's important to keeping the relationship moving forward. So we have meetings here in the city for that. And then there's some of our government partners have teams here as well. And so it's a good opportunity to touch base with them much in the same way. And a lot of the rest of it is just going around and seeing old friends and looking for serendipity, I would say, just waiting in the lobby of the St. Francis and seeing who wanders by. And a lot of times that's the most productive thing for me.
Yeah, you made a joke, I think, when we were trying to get this scheduled, and there was some jostling that, a lot of these meetings don't go anywhere anyway. So this is going to be more fun.
I don't know. Some people do that, right? They do this thing where it's like 30-minute time slots and everybody's sprinting, from building to building through the rain, we don't do that. Maybe we should. I don't know. Am I missing out?
I don't know. I come here and I hole up in a room like this and do interviews with folks like you. So I don't know what's, until it's reception time in the evening, I really don't know what's going on out there.
Fewer better meetings. I think that's our philosophy. I might be wrong about that.
Yeah. Another thing we talked about the last time we chatted was sort of the, big picture biologics development sort of cost paradigm. And as a result of that, ensuing patient payer costs and just the way that business has always been done. And I know that's a great, big, giant question, but you had some opinions, if I recall, on how that changes and perhaps how Lumen is contributing through the work that you're doing to driving change. So let's talk about that a little bit. Share, I guess first give me your perspective on the sort of the status quo. And then some thoughts on where you see yourself and Lumen affecting that status quo.
I think this is a fascinating topic. I mean, there's a lot of good data out there, in my opinion. the data from Deloitte and Touche is a big accounting firm, and every year they look at the productivity, the R&D productivity of the industry, and they add up what are the costs of making a new drug, across the industry. So it's an average, and there's exceptions both up and down. But and then they say, well, now let's do our best to to estimate what are the revenues going to be from all the products all that R&D. And so you can say, calculate a return on investment. So very simply, if you borrow your money from the U.S. Treasury at, let's just say a couple of years ago, to 1%, and then you invest it in bonds at 10%, and you don't have any defaults, then that's good because you made a 9% margin, right? It makes sense, profitable. But what our industry does, by Deloitte's math, is they borrow money from shareholders and bondholders at 11%, and their return on investment for R&D is 1%. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they're destroying capital, according to Deloitte. To my amazement, this is not a universally held view. I was at a reception last night talking with a senior person at a very, very large CRO, and she insisted this couldn't possibly be true. So not everybody believes that. I think though it's hard to disagree with the math. Deloitte's pretty good at running numbers, and there's some other academics like Jack Scannell who's written about this extensively too. So if it's true, kind of puts you in a pickle if you're running a biotech company, because how is that appropriate? Taking money from investors and destroying it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time thinking about this. For us, it goes a little bit back to what we were talking about earlier. We were fortunate. There's an awful lot of serendipity in how Lumen came to be, and sort of path dependency and random introduction to the Gates Foundation, the DoD with COVID and other things. A little bit of it is that, it's much easier to make a return on investment if there's a public interest in the thing, and so the federal government, helps build it out. A great example being the COVID vaccines that Moderna made, right? A lot of money went in there. Fabulous, deal for the American taxpayer, even despite the subsidies. But mostly it's the fact that of necessity, we've had to be much more efficient. And by luck, our biology, because it doesn't require sterility, is just a lot cheaper. So at the end of the day, ultimately, what it boils down to is everything up to early clinical development is between 10 and 100-fold cheaper on our platform to put a single therapeutic protein into the clinic. Where we hit the wall, though, is in late clinical development, mm-hmm. where you got to run multi-site trials for a lot of diseases, and there we're thrown into the clutches of the market price. And then standing behind that is commercialization, which I think is another interesting and risky and very expensive area that we haven't yet started to unpick. But I think there's, in my ideal world, we figure out a way to make those two things also 10 or 100-fold cheaper for the types of products we make, and then we really have something on our hands, wouldn't we? But how do you go about doing that in particular? Well, I think it's pretty interesting. There was an article this morning. And I think it was in either Stat or Endpoints, and they were talking about BeiGene. Something unusual about BeiGene is they run all of their own clinical trials and have a huge staff of people. They don't outsource it to, contract CROs. Mm-hmm. And the point of the article is their view, anyway, is that this allows them to run, better trials less expensively, basically reversing the outsourcing trend. And I think there's another interesting thing on the commercial side going on right now. Did you see this news about Lilly? It's pretty funny, actually. They announced they're going to sell, Mounjaro basically direct to consumer. But it was alongside an angry letter saying, look, he's scolding people that were getting the GLP-1 analog drugs for cosmetic, weight loss. Mm-hmm. And they were saying, definitely don't do that. But by the way, here's our direct to consumer, right. Portal. But definitely, only use it, if it's appropriate, not for cosmetic purposes, which is sort of an interesting example of speaking out of both sides of your mouth. I think it's going to be an interesting experiment. And the GLP-1s might be the perfect way to do this if we can figure out a way to disintermediate all of those, middlemen, in the supply chain for biopharmaceuticals. Could that make a big difference in, cutting the costs? Yeah, potentially. Maybe that's part of the productivity improvement our industry needs.
What are you're in the throes of that CRO. You talk about the cost of clinical development and clinical activity. What are you, I guess, finding or taking away from that experience where you think, you hinted at, well, if we could address that, how do we do that?
Yeah.
Would you have any Any thoughts on how to do that?
I don't think we figured it out yet. I wish we had.
Yeah.
For non-spec, I'm not a clinician. As you know, I trained as a lawyer, so I'm a bit of an outsider to all of this, and that's an advantage and disadvantage. Because outsiders come into problems with the fresh perspective, and you ask dumb questions, and it's acceptable. But on the other hand, boy, clinical development is a baffling activity. There's a lot of things that happen, and many of these CROs are just very, very good at what they do. But there are also a lot of crazy horror stories about budget overruns or performance lapses. I think at the moment, the thing that I'm sort of obsessing about most right now is this fact that legally, as a trial sponsor, the organization, my company is responsible for everything going right that the contractor does. The difficult thing is that it's hard enough to manage employees and have transparency into what people are doing and make sure everybody's got the resources they need and thinking about it in an aligned way, and all of the management talent that goes into getting an organization to all row the ship in the right direction. And the thing is, when you outsource it, all of those problems become much harder, but your legal responsibility, your ethical obligations to make sure it's all done correctly are no different. But it's just a much more difficult talent management problem, I think. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know what the answer is. This is we'll see how this unfolds. Maybe Beijing's right. And
well, I was going to ask, like, how credible, or not how credible, but how how realistic is that for a company that's not Beijing, right?
Yeah.
How realistic is it for a biotech that is at Lumen stage, a clinical stage biotech that is relying on outside funding to even consider that? I would imagine not. I don't know.
I don't know. Plenty of people told us that it was impossible to build a GMP plant, and then we built not one but two. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. It's just something fishy about the facts of the world, which is the CRO industry, the clinical CRO industry, is pretty new, actually, really, in its modern version. I think the story I've heard is that it really originated in the late 90s. So how were people running all those trials before that existed? It's encouraging because it was much, new drug discovery, R&D productivity was much higher back then too. So it's a fishy coincidence.
Yeah.
Now you might say, well, Brian, it's a good news because thank God they brought in the clinical CROs when they did in the 90s, because imagine how much worse it would have been if it weren't for that professionalization and efficiencies of this sort of outside specialist function coming into being. It could have been even worse.
Yeah,
but
maybe.
But like I say, causation is a difficult thing to nail down. There's something to that, I think, and I don't know. I wonder if Beijing might be in the right path.
Another thing that just occurred to me, you and I talked about the last time we chatted, was, and I see it playing out so far here as making a splash is AI. And when you and I talked about it, you were, I'd say, decidedly pragmatic about putting AI on its place as a tool. Maybe it's just I'm exposed to a lot of companies who are foundationally AI, who are creating a splash, right? They're in the pool, waving their arms around, making waves. What's your perspective on that? Like, maybe even since you've been here, is that a buzz that you're catching?
We use AI, ML. I'm not sure exactly where the dividing line is. We use these methods pervasively in our business. And we publish some papers. We have a string of collaborations with Google's machine learning AI team. And so I don't think we're slouches at AI or like skeptical that it has utility, but I think there's a lot of people interested in how's anybody going to make any money in that world that isn't like Microsoft. Like, for example, like ChatGPT. It's very obviously Microsoft's going to stick that in every Office product, right? And it's going to be amazing. It's going to be great when they get that all down and deployed and drive the cost of the processing down and everybody can use it. No doubt about it. But it's going to be the channel owners, I think, seems to be the answer. I know there's some questions about like search, and maybe AI is going to displace Google, and nobody saw Google coming either, me included. So I don't think I have any great answers. But in our industry, I kind of vacillate back and forth. On the one hand, I think there's so much utility and so many things that we do. But then I step back from it and I realize, well, wait a second, the problem isn't like a shortage of new molecules with different attributes. The problem is that trials are too risky and expensive and slow, and that's where all the capital gets gobbled up. And while there are people talking about AI as how it's going to help that, there's precious little evidence yet that it's going to happen. But maybe there'll be like the Google thing, and it'll happen. And I remember very clearly when the law school librarian introduced me to Google. It was a new website. I'm like, this is ridiculous. Who needs a new search engine? I can go to Alta Vista. There's Yahoo. If I want to ask my query in the form of a question, I can ask Jeeves. That's funny.
Right? We may need to put something in the show notes for reference for our younger listeners when you bring up Ask Me.
Nobody remembers any of that before there was Google, and it just totally changed everything. And maybe someone out there, I hope they are, that we're going to find a thing that'll just make drugs routine and amazing, like Google made search routine and amazing. I don't know. I guess I'm not really betting in that direction. But
Yeah.
You would know better. You talk to all the AI guys.
Well, I talk to all the AI guys, and typically those conversations revolve around, molecular identification and zeroing in on targets. It's not, I'm not in the clinical execution realm as much as I am in biologics discovery, design, and then process development. So I'm just curious about where that's going to take. Conceivably, those early efficiencies, like you said at Lumen, your early molecular creation is considerably cheaper, right? It's when you get into the clinic that expenses mount up like they do for everyone. So I'm as interested. I guess what I'm saying is I'm as interested as you are in how AI might contribute to a change in the cost paradigm across the spectrum, right?
Yeah, maybe so. I think the shortage in early stage discovery isn't molecules; it's targets, good targets. And this is true because anytime there's a good target emerges, like PD-1, then there's just a flood of great molecules. Well, GLP-1 right now, right? How many GLP-1 analogs are there out there? Every different flavor of ice cream is being rapidly pushed through the clinic. So there doesn't seem to be a shortage of ways to go after a target. Like, if only we had a way to make a molecule that could go after the GLP-1 receptor. That's not really the issue. It's just that all of these companies have to spend, depending on whose numbers you believe, $2 billion risk and probability, and time adjusted, or $7 billion probability and time adjusted capital to get one product through the clinic. That's where all the money goes.
Yeah.
Getting a molecule to load into that process is easy.
So given the breadth and depth of molecules and targets that perhaps targets, you tell me, that Lumen has in the years since you founded the company, you mentioned that you've got a sort of a choose your own adventure path ahead of you. You've got a lot of opportunity there. How does that play into your calculus around target identification and the indications that Lumen is pursuing and will down the road?
Yeah, I'm a little talking about a hat. You're kind of calling me out on this here because we don't do any of that. In our business, we have the luck of being the first to the field. So it feels a little bit like being, Genentech in the early 80s, where they finally figured out how to make monoclonal antibody. And there was a list as long as your arm of great ideas to go after. And that doesn't mean all of them worked. But many of them were amazing products, and they prop up the stock prices of some of these companies, like Amgen, for example, to this day, right? And Enbro, I think the first patent on Enbro was filed in 1989. So the persistence of being a first mover in a new field where you can do a thing that everybody knew would be a good idea for a long time, but now you can actually scalably execute on it is huge. For us, that means we really only go after targets that have a lot of not just animal data, but human clinical data validating the target biology, and in almost all of the cases, also the therapeutic modality, the sort of the mucosal topical delivery. Mm-hmm. So for us, what keeps others at bay, at least at the moment, we've kind of got the space to ourselves, is the scalability and cost efficiency of our platform for this particular application. If we could find a way, if the AI guys, as we're calling them, could find a way to get the same confidence in the target biology that using these techniques that we get out of dumb old-fashioned reading papers from sometimes 80s and 90s, mm-hmm. then they really have something. I mean, that would be a real gift to humanity. I don't think they've cracked that yet, but maybe there's something there.
Yeah. So give us an update on the clinical activity at Lumen.
Right. So a bunch of activity. We just wrapped up a trial a few weeks ago in December. It was a new area for us. Instead of delivering our protein therapeutic cocktails, antibody cocktails to GI mucosal surfaces, in this case, we were delivering it to the intranasal passage. Mm-hmm. What we're interested in that trial was, tolerability and safety. Obviously, we always look at that. Well, there's decades of clinical trials on that therapeutic modality, so we weren't so worried about that, but still happy to see that it was very well tolerated. The thing we're more interested in, we don't have the data on this yet, but we did a staggered dosing. We dosed some of these individuals, we were dosing them daily, some of them every other day, and some of them every third day. And what we're really interested in is taking the mucosal samples from the nasal passages, so we can build out a rough measure of how long the antibody cocktail persists in those tissues. This is under the COVID-19 program, the DoD funded clinical trial, but very obvious applications for not only for COVID-19, which, as I mentioned earlier, nobody cares about anymore, but right. There's a lot of other viral infections, influenza, RSV. This could have great utility for. The use case is really obvious. I think a lot of people would be interested, before they go on an airplane, taking some kind of antibody cocktail, mm-hmm. And just sort of coating the mucous membranes of your nasal passages of respiratory tract to at least reduce the odds of getting an infection during that window of exposure. And so that's very exciting. We'll have the PK data from that, I think, in a couple of months. This year, we have a lot on deck. We're running 5 trials we've got funded. We've got 3 more in various stages of getting funding committed for. So we can pull that off. That's 8 clinical trials to initiate this year, and some of them will kind of extend out their differing lengths. Right. So that's where the huge growth is for us, and it's why we're hiring and thinking so aggressively about clinical development costs. It's very salient, and also the manufacturing facility, because that's a lot of clinical trial material to manufacture in our GMP plant. So we're hiring very aggressively. If you're interested in a job, check out our website.
What sort of jobs are you hiring for?
Clinical, manufacturing, R&D. Yeah, those 3 areas.
Lumen Biosciences.com or
Lumen.bio.
All right, Lumen.bio.
Yeah.
Go there and check out the job offers. And speaking of jobs, so what you founded the company when?
2017.
Looking back on the years that have passed since then, what offer some pointed advice for companies? For folks who are in your shoes back then, first dipping a toe into founding a biotech company.
Okay.
You could go long on this, I'm sure.
Well, no, I'm quite the opposite. I was going to say, when I was selling overpriced legal services as a lawyer at Cooley, I used to tell people that advice is worth roughly what you pay for it. Okay, so free advice you got to take with extra grains of salt.
Sure.
So I don't know that I have any.
It's like the gift horse analogy, right? The gift horse. The saying is you never
don't look at the mouth, yeah.
But you do. Like if you're going to take on that, or the horse that's given to you is the one you really want to assess.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
you want to dig that apart.
I think advice comes in matched proverbs, and I think like proverbs are always matched, right? There's always like look before you leap, but it's also true that he who hesitates is lost. So, a lot of advice comes in these sort of mix and match things. And I think of them as being more like cones. There's just sort of things you want to, meditate and think about. And then you still got to make your own decision about what's the right thing. So 2 cones that I recommend is thinking about that were important to me. First of all, I can endorse the lifestyle. It's not for everybody, so you got to know yourself and make the right choice. But it's great fun starting a company. I mean, it's especially fun when it's winning. It's especially agonizing when you're, struggling, and you get plenty of doses of both. It's a very high emotional valence activity, running an early stage company. But it's great fun. I recommend it to anybody that has the slightest inclination. And then the second thing is maybe related. If part of what makes it fun is the unpredictability of it, and boy, our experience is there's just been so much serendipity driving so many critical events in the company's development. There's just no way we could have planned. I mean, just almost from the minute we stepped out of the gates, things started happening. Good and so, sometimes challenging, but mostly for the good. There's this feeling that as you start a new thing like this, and it's not just starting companies, I think it's starting new art programs or writing a book or something. There's a tendency of the world to just sort of, it looks like it's all closed up and impenetrable, and then you take the first step and everything just starts opening up in front of you. That's the kind of lived experience of it. So I guess translated into advice form, it would be to keep an eye out for the opportunities and don't get too attached to the path you think you're going to take.
How do you enable that? Like, serendipity doesn't happen in a vacuum. Like you can't have a great idea, hole up in a space like this.
Take meetings. You do just have an open mind and a naive attitude and a kind of a learning mindset, and you take meetings. So it's a short anecdote. We have time for a short anecdote.
Yeah,
this is sure. I like this one. My co-founder Jim, he's a scientist, and we started a company. Anyway, the Gates Foundation found us. We're based in Seattle. They're based in Seattle. They found us through a friend of a friend, and they had this problem. They're interested in. So they invited themselves to come over, and they said, well. I said, Jim, this is great. The Gates Foundation is going to come over. I don't know if you know this, but they've got all this money. It's great. So he says, well, what do they want to do? He says, I said, they want us to make antibodies in spirulina. He says, that's a ridiculous idea. He says, spirulina is a prokaryote. The mammalian antibodies require glycosylation and all of this sort of complicated stuff. He said, that's a really dumb idea. You take the meeting. I've got real work to do. That's a little words. I've got real work to do.
Wow.
And so I took the meeting because that's kind of my attitude. Who knows? And we sat down and I said, so what's going on? He said, so we want you to help us. We got this problem. We need, all these kids are dying in the developing world. We want to make an antibody cocktail so cheap that we can just feed it to these kids, stop them from getting these enteric diarrheal diseases, and save their lives. It's going to be great. And I said, I did what I usually do in this case, which is my eyes kind of roll back in my head, and robotically I try to remember exactly the words Jim said that are, the science. Because
not the words he said where that's
more politely, but I explained, it was like as a prokaryote, you might know this, but you can't glycosylation and all these things. And the guy stopped me and he says, no, you idiot. Not a mammalian antibody. We want you to make a camelid antibody fragment. It expressed great in prokaryotes. And I had dragged one of my scientist colleagues with me who was less rude than my co-founder. Mm-hmm. And it turned out to be a brilliant idea. It was like this kind of keystone in the arch that we were missing. As we started the company, we weren't sure exactly what the killer app was going to be. And this turned out to be the killer app.
Yeah.
We'd never heard about camelid antibodies. This was our introduction. And so everything flowed from that meeting. And there's, I tell you, there's been, 10 or 15 other things like this where just random circumstances generate almost spontaneously a path forward where, like I say, it just seems impenetrable thicket. And it happens so often. To answer your question, I don't know how to create it. While we were talking earlier, when I come down here, I try to have fewer meetings and more serendipity. And my way of doing that is lurking in, the St. Francis lobby or
get out
different places and waiting for things to happen. And God damn, it always does.
Yeah. Well, it's always a pleasure to have you. I'm going to let you go make some of that serendipity happen now. I really enjoyed talking with you. You're very thoughtful, excellent conversation. I appreciate having you on, and we'll do it again.
I hope so.
Yeah,
thanks, Matt.
We'll keep it up.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Brian.
I'm Matt Pillar, and you just listened to the Business of Biotech, the weekly podcast dedicated to the builders of biotech. We drop a new episode with a new exec every Monday morning, and I'd like you to join our community of subscribers at bioprocessonline.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to our never spammy, always insightful monthly newsletter at bioprocessonline.com/BOB. If you have feedback or topic and guest suggestions, hit me up on LinkedIn and let's chat. And as always, thanks for listening.